So we'll start by setting a positive motivation for our time. So we can think back to earlier in the day, the thoughts, the motivations that occurred that made us interested in attending tonight's class. And trying to get clear on that causal motivation. And by reflecting on it, we can see if there's room for making it more expansive. We may be looking for certain tools and techniques to benefit our lives. We can also think, though, what would it mean if I had those tools, those techniques? What would having more spaciousness, more calm in the mind, what would that mean for those around me? How can I use that to be of greater benefit? So we can try to generate a broader motivation that recognizes interdependence and cultivates a sense of wanting to be of greater benefit. All right. So, welcome to class 2 in Meditation 101. We were meant to have 4 classes, 4 Friday night classes this month. However, we ended up canceling the Friday night class last week so that we could engage in practice for Lama Zopa's swift return. So we will have 3. The first class that was before that on the 7th did take place, and that recording is on the YouTube channel. We did actually cover a fair amount of ground on the 7th. So we will carry on with today and then the 28th, and that will be the end of this series, because in May we'll be switching over to Venerable Katie doing Introduction to Mindfulness, which will be also on Zoom. We'll show it here, but she is elsewhere. So it won't technically be in person in the same way. Okay. So I don't know. Was anyone, I'm old. 2 weeks ago is a long time. Was anyone here, or did they miss the first class? Anybody?
I was here, but 2 weeks is quite a while. That's okay, though. Thank you for being back.
So I guess we'll just carry on from where I believe we essentially covered, luckily, I believe we covered the actual material from the first 2 classes. So my intent is just to carry on from where the material starts in the third class. I do think that we, in a way, touched on this, the where this picks up previously, but because where it picks up is talking about the two types of meditation that is typically practiced in Tibetan Buddhism. We have definitely said that meditation is, the definition of meditation is to familiarize the mind with a virtuous object. And you can also talk about the stages of concentration as another way of thinking about meditation. So you can think about meditation as both a process and a skill. The process of meditation is to familiarize the mind with a virtuous object. The skill of meditation is to progress through the 9 levels of calm abiding. At least a person may go on and practice the form and formless absorptions that are even deeper states. But those are not as emphasized in Tibetan Buddhism, but there are benefits to doing that as well. But at least getting up through fully qualified calm abiding is really an important, presented as an important goal for people to try to at least strive for. And if we don't fully reach that in this life, then at least we've created imprints in the mind for that kind of practice, and we can benefit from those imprints. Which, if we don't strive, then those imprints would never have been laid down. So there's benefit, even just in attempting to make it to the 9th level, because maybe we'll get to the 2nd, the 3rd, the 5th. Who knows? But the different types, so in terms of talking about it as a process, if we talk about it as a skill, then you could define meditation as the ability to concentrate the mind on a chosen object without distraction for as long as you choose. That's what a person who's developed fully qualified calm abiding is capable of. When we talk about it as a process, then there are 2 processes that we might use, 2 groups of meditative objects that we can choose from. And like I said, I think we touched on this, but so the first group is analytical meditations. So with this group, and it does get a little bit more complicated in this group, because there's, in a way, a subdivision of the intent of the meditation. Some analytical objects are describing reality from the viewpoint of a fully enlightened being. For example, the teaching on impermanence, that is a teaching that, of course, coming from a fully enlightened being. Maybe you don't actually need to be a fully enlightened being to understand it. But the teaching, another example would be the teaching on karma. Only a fully enlightened being can understand karma, directly, can actually see the karmic history of sentient beings and can predict the result of a current karmic action going into the future. But when we meditate on it, we aren't directly trying to accomplish that. We are trying to understand the characteristics of karma, which again, even the characteristics of karma, the fact that karma, is definite, that it expands, that it is individual, all the 4 characteristics, those aren't things either that we can directly perceive. That also is a teaching coming from the mind of an enlightened being. The nature of reality or voidness or emptiness, that's also an object of meditation that, as an ordinary sentient being, we cannot directly perceive. So those that category of objects is describing the way that the mind works, that reality works. You could say the way that the universe is set up, or the way that it functions. Not set up in the sense of like, um, from, intelligently or from a creator, but just like gravity or electromagnetism, it functions in particular describable ways. And with those meditations, the meditations that I might describe as either being, wisdom with a lowercase w or wisdom with a capital W, meaning, lowercase wisdom would be like impermanence, like karma. Uppercase wisdom would be wisdom realizing the nature of reality. Um, but all of those are describing how things function. And with that, the goal isn't to embody, we can't say that by meditating on impermanence, we embody impermanence, because the body and mind are already in the nature of impermanence. Um, but what we're trying to do is deeply understand that the body and mind and all other compounded phenomena are in the nature of impermanence, so that we can relate to the body, the mind, and everything else in a logical, reasonable way. So in a constructive, uh, valid, conventionally reasonable, um, way that is relatively less influenced by afflicted states. Um, Other kinds of analytical objects are like the object of compassion, love, generosity, patience, ethics. These are not describing how the external world, functions. You could say that they are describing, how the mind would function if it was free, completely free from afflicted states. But we live in a world presently where the our mind, and just about everyone else's mind, is influenced by afflicted states. And so, conventionally speaking, it isn't true. And it's also true that it's a choice. We have no choice that our mind and our body and all compounded phenomena are in the nature of impermanence. That's just simply a fact. Um, but whether we choose to cultivate love or compassion or generosity, that's an option. We can do that, or we can choose not to do that. And those are both valid. Maybe there's reasons to do one, or not. But it's an option that we're presented with, and we have to decide to cultivate those states. So in a way, we can say that it is still describing how our minds can function or will function, but it's not really describing, but only if we get to the point where we completely free the mind of all afflicted states. Then the mind spontaneously, naturally, is in the nature of love, compassion, generosity, patience, and so on. But if we never develop the mind to that level, then we can't say that the mind um, can operate in that way. So the goal then with those kinds of meditative objects is to become that mental state, is to suffuse or imbue the mind with that mental state, to become love, to become compassion, to become generosity, to actually fully embody those mental states. Whereas, like I said before, we're not embodying impermanence. We're trying to understand that impermanence is already characterizing everything, so that our interactions are wiser and less deluded, less afflicted. So there is a difference between, even within analytical meditation, there's a difference between the goal of meditating on certain analytical objects versus certain other analytical objects. And I do think that we've said, before, that analytical objects involve the following in meditation, the following of a chain of logic or reasoning or argumentation to give rise to an insight, and that argumentation logic is a vehicle for the insight, and the insight is ultimately the goal, is ultimately the point of that meditation. So we might remember someone that we feel love for naturally, spontaneously, and which isn't really, we might consider why we feel that way. So I mean, there's different processes. It's analytical in the sense that it requires the use of ideas and thoughts. So there's many different ways. Some ways are more directly visceral, like maybe that one where you recollect someone who you feel warmly toward, and then maybe memories of their kindness might appear to the mind, and so on. And then, you focus on the sensation, the mental thoughts, the physical sensations in the body, how the mind is in that moment embodying love, or compassion, what have you. And then you just use a remembering consciousness to extend, to generalize that subjective state to other sentient beings. That's one way. Another way is to think of the advantages, perhaps, of love and the disadvantages of hatred. That's not necessarily relating, using specific people, but it's just thinking about what are the advantages and the disadvantages of this or that, to show the logic, the reason, of engaging in a particular way of thinking or relating to sentient beings, and avoiding a disadvantageous way of thinking or relating to sentient beings or with sentient beings. And then, of course, there's like deity yoga practices, which is a whole like sort of supplementary system of kind of doing the same thing, where you have the Buddha of love, the Buddha of compassion, Tara representing enlightened activity, all of these different manifestations. And then by um, understanding the meaning of their form and engaging in their mantra, and kind of merging with that energy, it's a sort of supplementary system that works on maybe a deeper, more subconscious level of the mind. Yeah. Is that everything that I... Yeah. So, and they're all analytical in the sense that they do require conceptuality in order to generate the object, the intended meditative object. Stabilizing meditation would be like using the breath or bodily sensation, which doesn't require any conceptuality. The breath is a physical sensation. You could scan the body, you could observe the arising and falling away of mental events. Those are all stabilizing meditations where you your goal is just to focus on one thing, and that you're not actually generating, you're not intentionally creating in the mind. It's just there, it's naturally present. You're not generating it intentionally, and your goal is just to concentrate the mind on it. So these two are both important in terms of a total practice. A person would need to do, if a person wanted to have a well-rounded practice, they would need to do some sessions of one as well as some sessions of the other. Maybe not every day, but in the course of a week, for example. Because stabilizing meditations, because they lack intentional conceptuality, in theory, the mind can be more concentrated. Whereas before and prior to developing fully qualified calm abiding, the intentional discursiveness of the mind that comes along with analyzing um, creates a busyness in the mind. And so, of course, in either case, we notice distraction and we move the mind back. We notice distraction, we move the mind back, and we generate concentrated states by doing that. But when the object itself is unchanging and there's no intentional discursiveness, then that object, you could say, is more well suited to progressing toward calm abiding. So it's good to not exclude one or the other in a total practice. Any thoughts or questions?
This might be slightly off topic, but in the experience of like working with focusing on the breath, sometimes I know it can bring up mental affliction. Sometimes it can seem to, for me, have been almost the outcome of a session to feel more afflicted, as if it's bringing up stuff and yet I haven't worked through it. Can you comment on that, on what to do with that?
Yeah, so definitely part of it is generally we haven't really tried to concentrate the mind. So part of it is the mind, the nature of the mind is conceptuality. The nature of the mind is to know, is to just go here and there and there. And that the mind is just sort of racing all of the time. And when we try to rein that in for the first time, or, even for long periods of time when we're starting, we're noticing how distracted and so on the mind is. And so we start to get, in a way, discouraged. We start to feel like, it's hopeless, because we didn't realize how discursive the mind itself naturally is. Um, and then, of course, we also probably aren't, Buddhism, of course, would say that the thing that Buddhist practice is most directed at overcoming is the self-centered, mind, the mind of self-grasping and self-cherishing, which is sort of our default state. And so we're also probably not that cognizant of how under the influence of, so we might, also be noticing, that we don't always, the kinds of things that are happening in the mind are under the influence of negative mental states. And so that might be kind of a surprise as well, because we're just sort of paying attention in a more focused way than we were before. Um, but it's important to understand that our mind is not different than the mind that the Buddha had, the mind that Lama Tsongkhapa had, the mind, all of these great masters. They started out, in the same place, and they just kept going. They didn't, they noticed all of the same things that we are noticing, but they persevered, and gradually over time they gained control over those processes just by repetition and habit, and of course, probably takes multiple lifetimes, for most people. Um, and then I'm sure that there are also, you know, subconscious, like I was saying, if we wanted to put it in Freudian, terms or something, you know, Buddhism would say that we're driven by self-grasping and self-cherishing, and Freud would say, we're driven by these base sort of egoistic desires. It's all kind of the same thing. So, on a subconscious level, as the mind gets more quiet, more concentrated, but not so concentrated and so quiet that we've moved beyond that, then we are going to kind of stir up um, these things, and so certainly it's not uncommon for people, um, in retreats and things to be even experiencing anger and because these are the kind of um, drives that are based on self-grasping and self-cherishing that are pretty deeply rooted into the deeper, the subconscious. um, and we're sort of tapping into those more base drives that are there in the subconscious as we as our mind gets more quiet and concentrated. So I think it's part, I just would say, I think it's part of the process. And um, the goal, is really, again, what we're doing, though, is working on that system. We're directly, what the content of what we're doing is applying the antidotes to that. The content of what we're focusing the mind on are the things that are going to be effective in overcoming these things that we're noticing, these afflicted states that we are noticing kind of are pretty deeply rooted in the mind. So I think it's also about having that kind of confidence and recognizing that, you know, it's not like I'm not actually getting worse. I'm just kind of noticing what's there and I'm kind of stirring it up a little bit. But what I'm actually doing are all of the right things that in the long term will eliminate these afflicted states.
So I had a question as well, and that is, well, an observation and a question. The observation is that when I'm doing purification practice and focusing on the mantra, I feel similar to how I feel when I'm doing like a stabilization or breath type meditation, because it really concentrates my mind. And I
Mhm.
understand there's the discursiveness in terms of talking through regret and all the different elements that you address in the purification ceremony. But to be honest, and this may sound silly, but I don't know what the words in the mantra mean. Should I know, or would that make it more analytical if I knew what the Sanskrit meant?
So with mantra, I mean, of course, there's many different kinds of mantra, and not all of them have real clear English, meaningful English translations. Um, some do and some don't. Some are longer. The Vajrasattva, the 100 syllable Vajrasattva mantra is quite long, and it is more or less translatable into English. It's sort of a supplication to Vajrasattva. Um, so, and I think it might be in the appendices of the short Vajrasattva mantra of the FPMT's booklet. That's not the one that we use, that Venerable Katie uses. I think she kind of has, but FPMT's actual technical short practice, I think in the appendices, there is an English translation um, of the meaning of the Vajrasattva mantra. So some mantras, can be understood in English, but others, really it's kind of, it doesn't mean so much. So I would say that I don't, I think it's up to the individual to, certainly it is not required. The purpose of the mantra really is the energetic resonance of the mantra. And so the functioning of the mantra on that level doesn't depend on understanding its meaning in English. And like I say, it isn't possible with all mantras. Um, I was curious, about the meaning, and so I think it kind of depends on the person. It can be, you know, I think that there can maybe be some additional value that's not strictly necessary if it's possible, like it is possible with Vajrasattva, to connect to it, to kind of, in a way, because if you do it every day and you're doing it for a long time, I think that you don't necessarily follow along in your mind like word for word, because there is no way to map the the word for word of, or the syllable by syllable of the mantra onto the English meaning. But when you understand the English meaning, then you have a sense of the purpose of the mantra, what the mantra is communicating, if and when that is possible, like it is with Vajrasattva. So that can, in my mind, that can give rise to a feeling that adds another layer to the practice. Because like I say, it is a supplication to Vajrasattva. So maybe, it just, when you do understand it, there's an additional subjective feeling state that could be present at that time. But if you think, oh, I would prefer not to know, or then, it really is the resonance of the mantra itself that is meaningful, in that sense.
Okay, thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? So we'll talk now about obstacles to meditation, and then of course what to do about the obstacles. Not just be like, oh, those are bummers, but when they arise, how do we actually respond? What do we actually do to overcome the obstacles? We'll be getting to that as well. So there are 5 historical obstacles to meditation, and I'll just list them to begin with. The first is laziness. The second is forgetfulness. The third is two ideas, but they list them as being together. So laxity and excitement. Those are one obstacle, but 2 very different mental states. The fourth is non-application of an antidote, and the fifth is over-application of an antidote. Okay. So now we'll look at those kind of individually. So laziness is basically what we deal with kind of before we develop a really stable practice, and from time to time, probably for a while thereafter. It's kind of, it isn't really necessarily what's happening in a session of meditation, but it's what's happening that prevents us from starting or wanting to meditate. It's kind of not having the discipline or the interest to engage in meditation. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we are, from the Buddhist point of view, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're just, watching Netflix or, just sleeping all day. It isn't necessarily that. It literally just means being otherwise engaged. So busy or laziness can look, from the Western perspective, it can look like productivity. It can look like being really devoted or interested in your, of course we all have, most people have careers and family, and of course, it isn't to say that we shouldn't or don't, we have to give up those things or not have them. But given that those are parts of our lives, how do we still fit in a meditation practice? How do we still make time for a meditation practice? Because if we feel like we're not capable of fitting in a practice because we have this and we have this, so that kind of busyness, it can, it might be bringing us wealth, it might be bringing us a good reputation or respect in our community, what have you, awards, and so on. But and there's many people, of course, that are really driven in that way to work all of the time, to get to the next level of promotion and so on. But that's laziness from the Buddhist perspective, even though we wouldn't describe it that way, because it's failing to make time for our meditation practice, and our study and our meditation, our formal kind of Buddhist practice in general. Even though it might look like, doing all of these quote unquote important things from the Buddhist perspective, what's really important is developing the mind in a spiritual direction. And in order to do that, we have to figure out, even given that I have all of, I may have commitments and so on, how do I still find time? How do I create a practice? And if we're not able to do that, or we feel like we're not able to do that, that's laziness, because we never really generate a consistent practice. And like I say, it's something that we're still going to, there are going to be days and even weeks where maybe it had been going well, and then that day, that week, there's a lot of things that are happening, and they're taking us away from our practice. And so we always have to, we're going to be combating that for quite some time. Okay. So then the second is called forgetting the object. And this is what happens actually in meditation. So now we are actually meditating, and we always have an object of meditation, whether it is the breath or whether it is loving kindness, what have you. And then distraction, of course, will arise in the course of that session of meditation, which will take us away from the object. And that's forgetting the object. And recollection or mindfulness is the antidote to that. It's literally, they say, forgetting the object is the obstacle, remembering the object is the antidote, which isn't particularly helpful, except for the fact that we understand that a session of meditation is unique in the sense that we do give ourselves the instruction to keep coming back to the intended object. We don't indulge in distraction. We notice the arising of distraction and move the mind back again and again and again. That's the process of recollecting the object through the application of mindfulness and introspective awareness. Any thoughts or questions about the first two before we move on? Yep.
I've been finding sometimes that I'm able to remember the object for a long time, but still have like thoughts happening kind of in the background. So does that count as forgetting the object, or I mean?
Yeah, that could be more like a subtler version of excitement, because excitement is a mind. Um, at the, of course, in the beginning, if a person's just starting a meditation practice, then forgetting the object is like, now you're thinking about your vacation that's coming up, or now you're thinking about dinner, what have you. Um, it, there are subtler levels where there's sort of like, they describe it as kind of like fish under the ice that are like, you're still looking at what you're looking at or doing, but the mind isn't fully absorbed. It's not, there's like this little disturbances in the mind, these agitations, these that can occur without fully moving the mind away from the object and toward. Um, so in a way, that's probably more like a subtler version of excitement, because excitement can also be directly related to forgetting the object. Like I say, when the object is the distraction is so powerful that now we're just absorbed in, oh, this person said this, or, this is what I'd rather be doing, that kind of thing. But still, I mean, yeah, so it's still an obstacle, but it's an obstacle related to subtle excitement. Because I mean, it's an obstacle if a person's goal, of course, is fully qualified calm abiding. If that's the end goal that we're all striving for, then anything that's not that is something to make additional progress on. Because even if a person's on the 8th level of calm abiding, it's not the 9th level. So you want to get to the 9th level ultimately. If any other thoughts or questions? Okay. Okay, so now we will go on to excitement and dullness. Again, these are presented together, but they're kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. Excitement is a distracted, energetic, speedy sort of mind, a scattering of the mind that is moving to other objects. That's like, and again, it can have different levels of intensity, but it's a mind that is becoming interested in anything that's other than the intended object. Um, and then dullness so it's kind of a high, excited, bright, scattered mind. Um, and then dullness is the other side of that spectrum, where the energy level isn't bright and excited, but it's too low. It's a dim, dull, almost tending toward drowsiness, kind of lack of clarity sort of mind. Um, So on the extreme of that, you literally can, of course, fall asleep. Like that's certainly an obstacle that, maybe depending on if we're meditating on the wrong time, or we just didn't sleep. Only got 2 or 3 hours of sleep, the night before, or it's maybe too dark, in the room that we're in. There could be a variety of factors. But it could just be a mind that feels heavy, that feels kind of thick, kind of dull, kind of dark, where there's just a real lack of clarity, a real lack of sharpness in the mind. And so these are both going to occur. Again, this isn't like, oh, excitement arose in the mind, I'm a bad meditator, dullness arose in the, like it's not, we have these 5 obstacles because for 2,500 years, every meditator has observed these 5 things are happening in their mind as they're attempting to progress to fully qualified calm abiding. And so these will both happen, even, potentially even in the course of a single session of meditation, we can have some excitement and some dullness. But, maybe probably will happen different times of the day or on different days. One will predominate or the other will predominate. But essentially, somewhere on this spectrum, until a person has developed fully qualified calm abiding, um, they're going to be having some level of excitement or dullness in the mind. Um, okay. So, in general, when we talk about antidotes to um, either dullness or excitement, really, just like with forgetting the object, the first thing that we need to do is to notice, is to be vigilant about the arising of excitement or dullness in the mind, to be alert, just like we need to be alert to when the object is loving kindness and now I'm thinking about dinner and I need to go back to loving kindness. We need to just actually even notice just the energy of excitement or dullness in the mind rather than, in a way, kind of like when Venerable Sangye Kadro was talking about the precursor to afflicted mental states being just an agitation in the mind, just to notice at that point, like before it's actually anger, to notice that there's dissatisfaction in the mind, to notice that there's agitation, that the mind is not satisfied, is becoming, because then anger is could be the next step. Here we can get to the point where it isn't the distracted object of the vacation that we are noticing, but we're actually noticing the bright, the overactive nature or the overactive energy that's present in the mind. That that is in a way better, but it's just something that would happen naturally after years of a practice, that we progress. And again, just like with the arising of the delusions in daily life, we are bound to, for a long time, only notice the actual full-blown jealousy or ill will or whatever it might be prior to having the awareness of that agitated state. But the agitated state is what gives rise to the full-blown experience. So that's what we are addressing more directly. So vigilance work equally well for excitement or dullness. So when dullness is, or I'm sorry, when excitement is arising in the mind, there are a couple of things that we can do. We can shift our attention back to the breath. And because again, the mind, if we're doing, for example, an analytical meditation, then we can, because that is introducing some discursiveness, perhaps we might say, okay, I will do a few minutes of breathing meditation. And really, breathing meditation, that's predominantly why most analytical meditations in the Tibetan tradition begin with 3 or 5 minutes of breathing meditation, because it's really not actually presented as a meditative object in Tibetan Buddhism, really. I mean, it is because meditation is, it is only in the sense if our motivation, if our motivation is virtuous, then of course the object, but the object itself is quite neutral. The breath isn't naturally virtuous or beneficial. But if we think, oh, my goal is to develop fully qualified calm abiding because I want to achieve enlightenment, and we're using the breathing meditation to do it, then in that way, kind of in a roundabout way, becomes a virtuous object. But it's really more so presented as a technique for calming the mind, for concentrating the mind, rather than actually, it's not presented, because to be honest, in Tibetan Buddhism, the image of the Buddha is a much more common object for single pointed. I should have, but in a way, it it's not it's not an object of stabilizing meditation in the same way that the breath is. But once you become deeply familiar with it, then it can arise in the mind kind of naturally. um, yeah. So, but you don't find in the Theravadan tradition, you find breathing meditation really emphasized much more, whereas you find visualization of the Buddha really emphasized much more. So, but going back to, kind of leaving the analytical object and going to the object of the breath is one way, because then you can really tighten down your focus without that intentional discursiveness. Another technique is a visualization technique, which is, so if we are using another way, we might be using an image of the Buddha. And if we're doing that and we're finding that the mind is quite discursive, we can hold the view that the image visualizing has a weight to it, has a mass to it. Even though we're still going to visualize it as radiant and made of light, and kind of transparent, still we can hold the view that it has a weight to it. And that will help to stabilize the mind. If we find that if we've taken that as the object and still there's this discursiveness, or we can make the image much smaller. We can visualize, typically you would visualize the Buddha as being about the size of your hand, or the palm of your hand above the crown of your head, but you could shrink it. And that's said to also be helpful. Another option is, instead of moving to the breath, another option is to imagine a seed, like a sesame seed or what have you, at the level of your navel inside the body. quite a small seed, and visualize that the top half is white and the bottom half is red, and then just concentrate on that image. And what that would do is, what they say is that when we concentrate, the mind goes kind of to wherever the mind is concentrated. So there's a chakra, they call it the navel chakra, not creatively, in that, right there. And so when you are concentrating your mind inside the body, kind of like right in front of the spine at the level of the navel, then you would be necessarily bringing the mind or bringing your attention to the navel chakra. There are ways of visualizing the navel chakra that aren't being described here, like visualizing the ways in which the central channel and the left and the right channels are intertwined at the navel chakra, but that's not the technique that's being described here. The technique is really just putting a focal image at that location, with the understanding that when the mind is concentrated more so at the lower chakras, then that will ground the mind. That will bring the energy, the brightness, the excited energy of the mind down in a way. And then another thing to do, or a thing to check, is our posture. We talked about the posture before, and it could be that with excitement, there could be too much, so with dullness, as I mentioned, it could be that there's not enough light in the room, and that's triggering our natural drowsiness. But it could also be that we just have too much light in the room, and that there's kind of too much stimulation going into the eyes. So we want to, maybe if we can at least think about toning that down and seeing, just as an experiment, seeing how that affects our meditation. And it could also be that they say, if we talked about how the head is ever so slightly downward, has a very, very small downward gaze to it, or downward tilt. So if we have, we may find that we're not doing that, and instead our gaze is sort of upward, which again is sort of the opposite of the lower chakras. And we're kind of, by looking up, we're kind of raising the winds of the body and mind in a way that could be contributing to the arising of excitement. So if we can, just check and see, is my head ever so slightly down, or is it more so now up? And do I need to maybe drop my posture, drop the head just a little bit to have that more so downward gaze? Another technique is to move again away from whatever the object was, and to reflect on a really serious or sobering topic, like, for example, our own mortality, to kind of be like, I don't have time for this, to kind of wake ourselves up and be like, oh, I just don't have time. What am I doing? I'm kind of wasting. My mind is attracted to all of these objects of attachment, or all of these different things but I'm going to die, and so that can kind of snap us out of, just like, in a way similar to, like, if we have a project that we're working on, and we find that we're scrolling through this or that, or playing this or that, then we really come back to, well, my boss might fire me, or if I don't get this done, that in a way can help us to move away from being motivated to be checking our social medias and whatever else. So that kind of sobering, kind of a reality check in a way, can be helpful. So those are some antidotes to a scattered mind. Any thoughts or questions about those antidotes? William says it seems like mindfulness is an overarching antidote to the obstacles to meditation. Is that accurate? So I think it begins with mindfulness. Um, it begins with a vigilant, because if we, like I said, we do have to give ourselves the instruction that I will notice the arising of distraction. I will notice, and I will not be tolerant of it. Within the bounds of being kind to ourselves, being patient with ourselves, understanding that it's part of the process. It doesn't mean we're a bad person, or not a bad person, but like a bad meditator or hopeless a hopeless Buddhist or something. Um, so it begins with vigilance. That's absolutely true. And then, of course, though, um, once we're tuned in, once we've used vigilance or mindfulness or however you want to phrase it, to alert us, oh, hey, distraction, excitement is rising, dullness is arising, then at that point, then the specific kind of antidotes come into play. And they're also important, because if it is excitement that is arising, you wouldn't apply the antidotes to dullness. You wouldn't try to make the mind brighter or increase, the energy of the mind, because the mind is already too energetic. You want to bring the mind down. And of course, the opposite is true. If dullness is arising, then you don't apply the antidotes to excitement. You don't bring the mind down further. You realize you need to bring the energy level of the mind up. So, we do have to clue into what kind of distraction is arising, so that we apply the correct, the specific antidote that will overcome what is arising in the mind. But it is true that as a skill, we need to develop introspective awareness. We need to develop a vigilant mind, so that no matter what obstacle is arising, we know exactly, we recognize it for exactly what it is, so that then the right kind of approach can be utilized. Any other thoughts or questions? So then dullness, again, is sort of the opposite, or laxity or dullness. So again, here with this, we can again check our posture, because the posture is really important for helping the winds to flow, in a really conducive way. We may be slouching, we may be, hunched over, we may be leaning. So we can correct that. We can bring the body back up to a really nice, upright position. And again, we can do a similar meditation to that seed, that red and white seed. But rather than concentrating the mind at the navel chakra, we can visualize that seed, we bring it up and we shoot it up through the top of the back of the head. So we kind of bring it up, because again, that is raising the energy of the mind. That is helping us to associate with the higher chakras in the mind, the crown chakra, the third eye, or the forehead, throat. These kind of upper chakras is what we are going to be attending to when we bring that seed up and sort of eject it mentally through the top of the back of the head. Um, And then the opposite of a sobering, if we were to think about doing a short reflection like we did before, the opposite of a reflection on a really kind of sobering topic would be something really joyful. Like, for example, instead of thinking about, how you're going to die and there's no time and you need to kind of get your act together, you would be concentrating more so on how extraordinary your precious human life is, um, or the qualities of the Buddha, or the qualities of the Triple Gem. Something that kind of gives you energy, that kind of brightens the mind. Um, any other thoughts or questions? Okay. So then the last two are either not applying the antidotes when they are needed. So this would be like just indulging in distraction, noticing that the mind is distracted, noticing that there is either a really overly bright mind or an overly dull mind, and then just not doing anything about it, kind of allowing, um, sort of thinking about meditation as just a sort of restful, peaceful, calm activity. And it's certainly presented that way in a secular context, but that's not really the Buddhist way of thinking about it. The Buddhist view, there's not going to be music, there's not going to be, it's not meant to just, those are side effects. The idea that it is restorative, that it is, those are just kind of side effects to it, but they're not really the point. So that kind of dull mind can be attractive. A dull kind of, there can be, we can get kind of stuck in that. We can mistake that for clear meditation, and that's a problem. So that would be kind of the main way that we might be tricked, because it can feel very, very peaceful when the mind, but actually what's happening is that there is a dullness that's there in the mind, um, and we need to actually bring the energy up so that that clarity is there, so that the mind is really sharp and clear, and not just thinking, oh, this is really, kind of warm and peaceful and nice. And because it could be that the actual intended object is losing its focus, it's losing its clarity because of even subtle dullness that's arising in the mind. Um, so if we realize that there is dullness or excitement and we decide that, we're not going to do anything, that's not applying the antidotes. Um, Over application only applies really for pretty highly advanced meditators, people who are on, I don't know, the seventh or eighth ground, level of calm abiding. They are someone who has been meditating for decades and decades, probably. And a lot of that time, they were they were really using vigilance and introspective awareness to notice, the arising of dullness or excitement. So that's a real habit that they've developed. But now they don't really need to do that as much. They are really, really close to calm abiding. And so they might be looking too hard. They might be, kind of being too vigilant, or overcorrecting. kind of tightening down too much or brightening too much because of their past practice, because of how they needed to react to dullness and excitement at the earlier stages, and all of that familiarity and habit. They might be course correcting too much, or they might be not just kind of allowing their meditation to progress. They might be really kind of, but for us, it's not really an issue. So this idea of over application really isn't, generally not something that we need to worry about, but it is something that meditators that are closer to calm abiding, they might be moving the mind too far in one direction or another, because you really want to balance. You want to be kind of right in the middle, where the mind is bright and sharp, but also still and concentrated. So that's a balancing act between excitement and dullness that we are really trying to accomplish. And the distractions that are arising for them are really so subtle that there's not much that they need to do, so they can be a little heavy-handed at that stage. Okay, so those are the 5 sort of historical obstacles that you find, delineated in the sutras. Any thoughts or questions? Okay. So now there's negative states of mind as obstacles to meditation. And what this is kind of referring to is what motivates particular objects, particular distractions from, motivates the arising of particular distractions in the mind. And oftentimes it is negative states of mind that fuel the arising of distractions in the mind. So these 5 negative states are attachment, anger, deluded pride, jealousy, and ignorance. And these are, habit patterns in our minds. And what we'll find is, if we start paying attention to the types of things that we get distracted by when we try to meditate, we'll often find that it's because of attachment, anger, deluded pride, jealousy, or ignorance that is the reason why that particular distraction is what popped up in the mind. And I say deluded pride because pride in this context is pretty specific. It doesn't mean, feeling a sense of accomplishment or taking pride in an accomplishment. Deluded pride, those are not obstacles. Those are not problems. Thinking, oh, I did a nice thing. That's actually important. If it's, we can take pride in the wrong kinds of things, and things that don't mean very much, and things that aren't very useful, like, and of course we can take pride in really terrible things. So of course it does depend. If we punch someone in the face and then we think, oh, I stood up for myself, how great, I am for doing that. That's the wrong way to stand up for. That's the wrong way to enforce a boundary. Enforcing boundaries isn't something that Buddhism objects to, but punching people is a bad way of doing that. So, of course, we can take pride in the wrong sorts of things. And Buddhism would say, even if it's like, oh, I made $1 million last year, that's also something. And Buddhism would be kind of like, well, that doesn't mean anything. That's not important. That's not something that we should, it's not bad, but it might be energizing kind of the 8 worldly concerns rather than our spiritual practice. But those are just sort of asides, because deluded pride specifically refers to thinking of oneself as greater than or better than or higher than someone else because of a quality or an accomplishment that you perceive yourself to have. You may have it, you may be mistaken about the degree to which you have it, but it isn't just feeling good about it, it's actually thinking on the basis of this accomplishment or this trait, I'm actually superior to people, either a specific person or a group of people or everyone, whatever it might be. There's this element of comparison where you hold yourself above others due to a trait or an accomplishment. Um, you may validly have that trait or accomplishment, but you may also be exaggerating that trait or accomplishment. In either case, if you think that it makes you better than other people, that's deluded pride, and that's what Buddhism is talking about as being a problem, not feeling good. And like I said, Buddhism encourages us to rejoice in the spiritual things that we do, to demonstrate to us, oh, it was really good that I meditated yesterday. Oh, it was really good that I could have punched someone and instead I didn't. I restrained. I wanted to. I had the impulse, but I restrained myself. Those are good things that we ought to rejoice in, because they will show us what we want to get more of in the future. They demonstrate to us what decisions we need to continue to be making to keep us on the right path going forward. So Buddhism encourages us to, in a way, take pride in those things, uh, but not to say, "Oh, I'm this holy spiritual, and this other person is deluded and terrible, and so I'm better than they are." That, of course, is bad. It's just to think, well, in terms of my own life, I had 2 choices. I could have meditated or not meditated. It's better that I chose to meditate than not meditate. In the past, I found that harder. In the past, I didn't do that as consistently as often. Now I'm finding that I am doing it more consistently, and that's great. That's wonderful. I rejoice in how my own mind is changing, how my own mind is progressing, um, but never doing a comparison between oneself and others. Okay, so that was a lot. I don't know if any of that was necessary, but I just wanted to make sure that you didn't mistake the word pride, for something that's not actually being talked about. Okay, so attachment. This might be the last. We'll look at attachment as the first in this list in a little bit more detail, and that might be the last thing that we do. We'll see. So attachment is, these are all very technical, specific things. Like I said, with deluded pride, attachment is a mind that observes an object, and by object, I mean that which can be cognized. So it doesn't mean inanimate, it just means an object of knowledge. So another person can be an object of knowledge, a situation like a job or a title or a status. Those are objects, those are things that can be cognized. Um, so we observe an object that can be cognized, and we observe that something about that object is pleasant or enjoyable, and we think, oh, I enjoy things that are pleasant. I like, good food. I like good music or pleasant sounds. I like things that, you know, feel nice, silk and comfy beds and whatever. I enjoy those pleasant experiences. Can also be like having wealth or being um, being seen as having attained a particular, like going for the vice presidency of your company, because other people will then treat you differently or think about you. They'll respect what you've done and so on. But you see some benefit. You think that that's pleasurable to be thought about or talked about in that way. So because there's this thing that we're cognizing and we believe it has a pleasant aspect to it, we then think, in order for me as a person to be happy, I have to be in contact with this external object that seems pleasant, that seems like it has a pleasant or pleasing aspect to it. I have to bring that into my experience, meaning I have to get that job, I have to marry that person, I have to live in that particular place, I have to have access to this kind of food, I have to be able to go to the beach every once in a while, or go to the museums every once in a while, whatever it might be, because those things are pleasant, and my happiness is dependent upon being in contact with things that are pleasant. Um, and therefore, by default, my suffering is impacted by the degree to which I'm separated from pleasant objects, or unable to become in contact, to that I'm thwarted from contacting pleasant objects. Like the movie is sold out when we get to the theater, or the beach is closed because of a red tide or something, or we want a particular relationship or job to work out and we don't get the promotion, whatever. We then think, by definition, I now must, my suffering will now increase, because my ability to contact pleasant objects was cut off. That's attachment. It is a mind, it's sort of a greedy mind, a mind that is never satisfied, never gets enough, always needs more and more objects of attachment, which are just objects that seem pleasant or pleasurable or enjoyable in some way, because the mind isn't balanced. The mind so the disadvantages of attachment would be another one of those analytical objects, for example, or the disadvantages of the energy of attachment would be another, to understand how we're deceived by thinking that the object is entirely pleasurable, that it's true happiness, that it's real happiness. It isn't to say that you know being homeless is not, maybe worse than being able to support yourself, so it doesn't mean that we don't see the value of an education, or see the value of attaining, enough resources to be able to be free from, living on the streets and, that sort of thing. Um, but it's a balanced mind that understands, yeah, I need to eat every day. I need reliable transportation. I need protection from the elements. I need clothing, etc. Um, but I understand that those things, they might be comparatively more useful than in a different state, but they're not real, genuine, true, lasting happiness in and of themselves. When I achieve that, when I get that middle class job and I progress from the, sort of entry level um, subsistence wage kind of job into the middle class job, well, now that middle class job is going to come along with new problems, and new stress and new anxiety and new demands on my time. And it's, maybe I had more time to do other kinds of things when I was, maybe I was barely getting by in this way, but maybe I had more free time to do these other things, and now I don't have that. Um, so it's a balanced mind where when we look at the food, we're like, yes, I've learned to enjoy chocolate. I've learned to enjoy this or that. But also, if I eat too much of it, it's going to negatively impact my health, um, and so on. Because it's not entirely pleasant. Um, and even if I'm able to eat it every single day in a small amount, still then I die, and then what? What did I spend my life trying to always make sure I had a piece of chocolate cake in the fridge? Or did I spend my life trying to develop inner qualities that will remain in my mind, the imprints of that will remain in my mind after I pass away, even, or did I focus on this material thing that even if I do enjoy it and even if I can make it a stable part of my life, that benefit is very small in its scope and very limited in its duration. Um, but as we know, when we meditate, we often will think about these objects of attachment. We'll often think about, oh, I wish I was doing this other thing that where my back wasn't aching, and or oh, I'm planning on having this really nice dinner, and what time is it? I hope that that's coming soon. And that's the energy of attachment that's operating in the mind that's causing these individual objects of attachment to pop up as we're trying to concentrate the mind on a virtuous object. Um, it's a very, very common experience. Okay. So again, so the object or the goal then is to cultivate a balanced mind that increasingly understands that objects of attachment are not made out of happiness. They're not real, true, lasting happiness. There may be some pleasurable aspect, but also there's a more complete picture there. They also come with problems, with the promotion is going to come with stress, the chocolate cake is going to come with health problems. There's it's a nothing is only pleasurable, which is how the mind of attachment, the energy of attachment, deceives us in thinking that it is truly only made out of happiness, that there's no downside, that it's just only one way. So interrogating that view, questioning that, seeing that that's false, is going to generate that more balanced perspective. And then we'll find that we've diminished the energy of that, and less often will we be bothered by thinking about chocolate cake when we're trying to meditate. Okay, any thoughts or questions about that obstacle, that negative mental state as an obstacle? Mm-hmm.
So I know you mentioned the different kinds of interrogation that we can use to understand whether we are attached or feel that energy coming. can you recommend like a broad test that we should ask ourselves or like think of to like, hey, am I attached to this or am I balanced?
So the question from the Gompa is trying to recognize attachment. How do we recognize it? I would say attachment is it. It doesn't mean that we can't enjoy something. So people who are renounced, who don't have attachment, they still might enjoy the taste of something, or they might like Bach, or I'm sure Venerable Rabina still enjoys, she talks about Bach, and so she's able to go and enjoy, and um, but if we feel I would say that if we feel a sense of loss, if we think about being separated from it, and then we feel pain in the mind, or agitation in the mind, um, that's a pretty clear indication that we've exaggerated that object, that it isn't like, oh, if somebody offers me a piece of chocolate, or I'll eat it and I'll be like, oh, that's great, but I realize that that's a fleeting experience. It's going to be there in the mouth for 10-20 seconds, and then it will be over, and then and then that's it. Like I'm not having that experience anymore. Do I then want to ask that person to go get me another piece of chocolate cake, or can I just let that be? Can I let that experience arise and be part of what I'm enjoying, and then it's gone and I'm okay? There isn't a pain, there isn't an agitation. I'm not grasping at needing that again and again and again. But I mean, this is a primordial, part of the mind, and so it isn't that we're going to just overcome this completely in any kind of time frame. Like, oh, in 5 years I'll be free of attachment or something. It's just something to be generating an awareness of, and then as it's arising, trying to notice, is this just something that I can participate in, and then allow it to end as is its nature, because there's no choice. The best food, the best conversation, the best, the sun's going to set, it's going to get cold, the park is going to close, it doesn't matter what we're doing, it's going to come to an end. Can we then move on in our day and just be like, oh yeah, that was great, and now this is happening, and now this is something else, and I'm okay that that happened and it was fun, and now there's a different thing that's happening? Or am I just like, oh, I'm so upset that, is there a depression, is there a pain? Um, any other questions? All right, so we'll leave it there for today, and we'll pick it back up. We'll look at anger and deluded pride, all the other negative mental states is where we'll start with next week. So just briefly dedicate. Felice, did you have?
Oh, no, that's okay. I was going to thank you, Bill.
So I just briefly dedicate. So we created a positive motivation, and then we listened and participated, and so we did that in order to actualize that motivation, which created positive energy in the mind. That positive energy is going to ripen as beneficial experience, and so we can dedicate how we want that positive energy to ripen, the beneficial ways in which we want to seal that energy. So we can just bring to mind, offering that energy for the benefit of others, thinking may it ripen in ways that support others, benefit others in temporary and ultimate ways. So however you want to connect with that, please just try to generate a sense of offering your effort for the benefit of other sentient beings. as many sentient beings as you can. All right. We'll see everybody next week. And we have a retreat with Venerable Sanghya Kadro this weekend, starting tomorrow, on Introduction to Tantra. So if that's something that you've heard about and you know that it's kind of like way down the line, at least you can get some kind of general understanding, so that that's something that you can work toward. All right. We'll see everybody next week.